Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the ARCO Forum. The Institute of Politics is extremely pleased to bring you the guest we have this evening, but the honor of introducing him we're going to give to one of our Institute of Politics Fellows, to Mark Merritt. Mark, as I trust a number of you have known or do know because you've been in his study group or been around the campus here talking with him, has a rich experience in our political system. And most recently, he was the Director of Communications for the Lamar Alexander for President Committee. And so he has a very personal and professional connection with our guest, and therefore we're delighted to let him have the honor of introducing him. Ladies and gentlemen, Mark Merritt.
Thank you, Paul. Well, it really is an honor to be an IOP Fellow. It was also a tremendous honor to be with Lamar Alexander, a businessman, president of a university, a governor, a presidential candidate. I was very honored to work for you, Lamar. I know that you'll go far. I thank you that you're continuing to try to do so. With no further ado, please welcome Lamar Alexander.
Thank you. Anyone who can make a short speech like that will go far in politics himself. Mark. Thank you, Mark. Mark Merritt is an enormously talented individual. I'm glad he's had the opportunity to be here, both for him and for this university. And it's a great pleasure for me to be back at the Institute of Politics and at Harvard. Don Price invited me in 1970 to come here after I'd managed a political campaign in Tennessee that won. And then I came back for the 25th anniversary. I was reminded when I was the U.S. Education Secretary, I remember it distinctly. Senator Kennedy was in the front row, and it was that night that I mentioned my proposal for a citizen Congress, which I call cut their pay and send them home. And he didn't smile during the whole part of that presentation. I know what some of you are thinking. The election is over, and already there's talk about the year 2000. And you're seeing President Clinton. You noticed that Senator Dole was on Saturday Night Live this past weekend. You're looking at me. You're remembering Pat Buchanan. And at least some of you are thinking, those guys aren't so good. I could do better than that. And you're already thinking about going back to your hometown and standing on the courthouse steps and announcing your own candidacy for the President of the United States in the year 2000. So since you're thinking that way, before I get down to business and talk to you a little bit about what I think happened in the election a couple of weeks ago and where I think the Republican Party is going, what I'd like to do is to reveal to you some of the secrets of running for president. I don't know them all. If I did, I probably wouldn't be here. I'd be somewhere else. But I can tell you a few of them. Secret number one, if you want to prepare yourself properly to run for president, is be prepared to be a gracious loser. I tried to be a gracious loser. I was prepared to be a gracious winner, but I had to repress every week something that Davy Crockett said, another Tennessean, when he lost his race for Congress in about 1830. Davy Crockett strode to the courthouse steps in Jackson, Tennessee, and he said to the assembled voters who were standing out in front of him what every defeated politician has always wanted to say to such voters. Davy Crockett said, "I'm going to Texas, and you can go to hell." Some people have asked me, what's it really like running for president? And I've tried to think of a metaphor. One is, I thought of as this: running for president is like walking across Niagara Falls on a tightrope in the dark with the wind blowing and a big crowd of people below shouting, "Fall." If you want to run for president, you better be prepared to pass the Mo Udall test. Mo Udall ran in the 80s, I think, and this is a true story. He walked into a barber shop in New Hampshire and introduced himself. "I'm Mo Udall. I'm running for president." The barber barely looked up and said, "We were just laughing about that yesterday." I remember one woman in Manchester, New Hampshire, on my walk across New Hampshire, reminded me, here's something else you needed to be prepared for. Don't expect everybody you meet to be thrilled by the prospect of meeting you. I walked up, I'm Lamar Alexander, I'd like to be your next president. She was taking a smoke break, and she looked at me, blew a little smoke in my face, looked at my red and black shirt for a while, and finally said, that's all we need, another president, and turned around and walked off. If you want to run for president, buy an atlas of Iowa and New Hampshire. I went to Iowa 80 times, and I walked 100 miles across New Hampshire. If you want to run for president, be prepared to enjoy fundraising. I went to 250 fundraisers between March the 6th of last year and March the 6th of this year. If you want to run for president, learn to speak in 7-second sound bites. We candidates got 79 minutes during January and February on the network news, which was the time it really counted in the Iowa caucus and New Hampshire primaries. And the amount of time we got to state our position about our role in the world or what to do about education or welfare averaged 7 seconds. And if you're still thinking about announcing your candidacy, there's one more example that you might want to consider. That's the example of General Colin Powell. I remember vividly, about a year ago this time, that Colin Powell was on the front page of every news magazine in America. Newsweek reported that General Powell's approval rating was even higher than the Pope's. And I was somewhere out in Iowa about the same time trying to say something that would get me on the front page of the Keokuk weekly newspaper. About that time, I was going back from some fundraising event late one night in New York, and it so happened that a staff member of General Powell was with us. And the inevitable question came up, will General Powell run for president? The staff member said, I have no idea if he'll run or not, but I can tell you two things about General Powell. One is he makes rational decisions. Two is he doesn't like uncertainty. And I knew in an instant that he would not be a candidate for president of the United States. It's not an especially rational decision, and it is a symphony in uncertainty. And there are a lot of things that need to be fixed about our system. We may want to talk about that, or you may in the question and answer session to list them quickly. One is it's overregulated. Of the first $10 million we raised in our campaign, we spent $1 million just on lawyers and accountants complying with the Federal Election Commission regulations and laws. Two is the scandal of campaign finance. My view on that may surprise you, but basically we have a system that limits the free speech rights of some candidates, but not of other candidates and to other organizations. And it creates a real scandal and an opportunity for abuse and limits the ability of voters to hear the candidates' messages during the election. And then the third thing that needs to be fixed is the primary schedule. Iowa and New Hampshire aren't the problem, but the campaign effectively ends in New Hampshire. That's the first primary, so it means that most people don't have a chance to cast a meaningful vote. What needs to be done really is to spread the primaries out after New Hampshire, perhaps in regional primaries over about 3 months, and give more people a chance to vote. But despite all those problems, and despite the humility of running for president, I wouldn't swap the privilege of competing to be the first president of the next century for anything in the world. I thought many, many times when I was in Florida or Iowa or New Hampshire, particularly during 1995 before the news media was paying much attention. I'd be in a meeting, usually smaller than this one. For about 20 minutes I'd try to say where I hoped the country would go, and then back would come the comments and the questions. And I would wish that people who were cynical about our presidential process could be a fly on the wall in those meetings, because the questions weren't fringe questions. They weren't antagonistic questions. They were about jobs, about families, about schools, about where's our country going. They were people really hungry for a vision contest, for a discussion about what kind of country are we going to have in the new century. And I believe that a principal reason, perhaps the reason, President Clinton was reelected was because he so well framed the issue in his Bridge to the Future. He framed the issue to cause people to believe that his vision for the future was that bridge, and that's what he talked about. And that's what the election should have been about, was about. And I think that was the strongest part of his presentation in the general election campaign that he won. Now, where does that leave my party, the Republican Party? That's what I'd like to talk about tonight. And I find myself strangely energized by where we are. And I'd like to try to explain in just a few minutes why. Here's what I believe the message of the election was. The era of big government will never be over until we have a Republican president. But we're never going to have a Republican president until our party can learn to describe what the post-big government era will be like. You see, I think the voters knew exactly what they were doing. They elected a Democratic president who said the era of big government is over. And then they elected a Republican Congress who actually believes it. And they put them there in that way on purpose. The voters were unwilling to turn the whole government over to us Republicans because we had not said what we were for. And President Clinton was able to persuade at least a majority that tomorrow would be worse than today if we were in charge of everything except perhaps for men making more than $75,000 a year. So the voters, in their wisdom, in a time of great change, have made sure that not much changes. They put things on hold. So what do we do as a Republican Party? Well, I think the worst thing conservatives or Republicans could do is to become timid, to back away from having a bold conservative vision of the future. In fact, I think the most important thing we need to do is to learn to say what we're for. In 1964, President Reagan gave he wasn't president then, he was just beginning his political career. He gave a speech called Time for Decision. Really launched his political career. And in it he established the two great enemies he saw. One was the evil empire abroad, and one was an arrogant empire, big government at home. And so for 30 years, we Republicans in our Lincoln Day meetings, in our elections, and our discussions have honed our skills, talking about how we would end the evil empire and end the arrogant empire. And now we've had a good deal of success. The evil empire is gone, and President Clinton even says that the era of big government is over. But in the process, we haven't honed the skills that we need to say what comes next. We're very good at what we're against. If you want to end this or abolish that or eliminate this or send that back, we can do it. We can talk about it. We can get in a room and thrill each other with stop the free fall in defense spending, balance the budget, eliminate the Department of Education, send welfare back to the state, stop illegal immigration at the border, and my favorite, cut their pay and send them home from Congress. We can clap, we can all say it, and we can get about 25% of the vote with that agenda. I believe in all that. I think that's all correct. I just think that's an unfinished sentence in each case. And I think most American voters do as well. You might be able to win a Republican primary with that agenda. You might be able to organize a conservative think tank with that agenda. You might even be able to be a semi-permanent majority Republican congressional party with that agenda, but we'll never be a governing party until we can learn to say what we're for. We need choir practice. We're singing the right song, but when we get to the part about the future, we're embarrassingly out of tune. And we need to work on that. We need to say, for example, take tax cuts. I thought Senator Dole was at his best in talking about his tax reduction plan, when instead of talking about trillions, he talked about his visit to the Casey's General Store Child Development Center in Ankeny, Iowa, and how his tax cut for a working mother there would be worth enough to pay for about 4.5 months of daycare. It wasn't so important that the working mother buy everything Dole was saying about the need for a tax cut. It was essential, though, that she understand that he knew that she struggles with child care. Or take education, which is my passion, what I care most about. Our policy comes across as eliminating the Department of Education and encouraging homeschooling, both of which I support. But that does not answer the education question for about 90% of America's voters. Our picture of America's future has got to include a vivid description of how every family may have the opportunity, several options, to choose one of the best schools in the world for their child. A school that is safe, where children are learning to excellent standards. And we should show how that happens and show how we're on the side of the parents who want that opportunity. My greatest worry over the next 4 years is not about what President Clinton will do. I think with a Republican Congress and with a president who's in many ways moving toward the Republican agenda, that the country's reasonably safe. But what I'm worried more about is what we won't do. You see, I think we as Republicans might become comfortable being a congressional party. We might look ahead to 1998 and say, well, 6th year of the president's term might be a good year to re-elect a Republican Congress. It's very hard to defeat incumbents after they're in for a while. And we might get into the pattern in this country of having a Republican Congress which is there to restrain a moderate Democratic president which is there to restrain a Republican Congress. And we'd go for a while. I don't want to see that happen because my view of America's future wouldn't be reached in that way. In my world, my Republican world, you see, I don't think we're ever going to have stronger defenses without a Republican president. Without a Republican president, I don't think we're going to have the proper focus on job growth. I doubt if we'll balance the budget. I'm sure we won't have enough choices of the best schools in the world for especially middle and low income families. I doubt that we'll be able to help people who need help with the tragic Washington welfare system that we'd like to change, and I know we'll never have an end to the era of big government until we have a Republican president. So I'm energized because I'd like to see our party have some choir practice for the next 6 months or 2 years and learn to sing in tune and say what we're for, so that when we get around to the congressional elections, and especially when we get around to the year 2000, we can make a cogent argument and explain why there ought to be a Republican government. Instead of just saying, stop the free fall in defense spending, even though only 4% of people say that foreign policy is important today, we should be saying, if we want to be a governing party, what we would do to restructure NATO. Should it have out-of-area exercises? And what are we going to do about the UN? Just continue to be a big deadbeat and not pay our bills to an institution that we don't respect? That's not much of an attitude for a governing party. Or balancing the budget. It's not enough to say balance the budget. Why don't we say, let's separate the capital and operating budget, like states do, and balance the operating budget, and do with the capital budget what most states do, if necessary, borrow to do things that are important. It doesn't make any sense for the greatest country in the world to go into the new century with lousy roads, run-down national parks, and inadequate schools, all capital items. There are a lot of areas like this. It is important, I think, to eventually eliminate the U.S. Department of Education. I've tried to get that done since I was governor in 1980 of the third poorest state. I wanted them out of the way so we could get on with it. And I think homeschooling is important. But it is more important to me to paint a vivid picture of a school like the City on the Hill Charter School where I was today. The President of the United States should be standing in Boston saying, lift the cap on charter schools in Massachusetts. This would show the way to the rest of the country about how to give the largest number of children the chance to go to the best schools in the country. Make every school a charter school. We're more likely to do that than the Democrats. Why don't we paint that picture? In immigration, we can't say, just stop illegal immigration. We've got to do that. We have more people coming across the southern border every day, illegally, than we had coming illegally through Ellis Island at its peak. But if all we do is blast illegal immigration, and if we don't celebrate the contributions of legal immigration and make a distinction between those who are legally here and pay their taxes and live by the rules, we will seem to be, at least, an anti-immigrant party in the nation of immigrants and will be irrelevant. That is not the route that I would like to see the Republican Party take. Stopping the government from taking private property is important, and it should pay for it when it takes it. And if you live in the West, where the government owns most of some states, you feel much more strongly about that than you might in the East, where the federal government doesn't own much at all. But even if that's true, a governing party would need to be able to say what our view of the great American outdoors is and how we'll clean up the air and the water, how we'll take care of the national parks. And even as much as I enjoy saying, cut their pay and send them home, really what I should be saying, if I want to be a part or a leader of the governing party in America, is we need to restore the respect we should have for Congress in a representative system. And the way to do that is create a citizen Congress with term limits. One of the major differences, perhaps the major difference, between the Democratic Party of the future and the Republican Party I hope to be a part of, is that we believe in less from government and more of ourselves. More accurately, we believe in less of government, a different kind of government, and more of ourselves. I say that because my view is that even though we're the greatest country in the world, we are profoundly unready for the new century. Last spring, my wife and I had a chance to attend an event that every parent dreams of attending. We attended the graduation of one of our children who actually graduated in 4 years from college. It was a time of a lot of memories. And one of those was a Sunday afternoon where our daughter Catherine was home. I was education secretary then. And I was going out, "Where are you going, Dad?" "Out to make a speech," I said. "About what?" she asked. "About the American dream," I said. "Dad," she said, "there are a lot of my friends who don't believe there is an American dream anymore." Stopped me in my tracks. And I found myself, over the last 4 years, particularly during my campaign for the presidency, trying to address myself, especially to young people, about why I think there can be that dream. And the first thing I have to say to them is that I understand how you feel. I mean, if you're in your 20s and you're looking ahead, you can wonder if your Social Security will ever be there. You can see a big debt that you're going to have to pay. You can see your work to pay your taxes. You can see finding a job's not so easy. You can see that your grandparents are afraid to walk in their own neighborhoods after dark. You can see your little brother or sister might be going to a school that's really more like a museum. People are working hard, but it doesn't fit the world the way it is today. You can see that racism's made enormous progress. We've made enormous progress against racism since the 60s, but it's still an ugly part of America. And if you look at the papers and see what records we'll be setting in the new century as we go into it, one will be we watch more TV per person than anybody else, and the other will be nearly 40% of the children will be born outside marriage. You can see how young people might wonder if the American dream will be there for them. Well, I happen to think that there's not much wrong with our country, that more jobs, better schools, stronger families won't fix. And I think the right leadership for the new century would not just give us a feint to the right and a trivial federal program, but would give us a step to the right and a different kind of government and a challenge to do more ourselves. There was about a week in that New Hampshire primary in February when I thought I might have a chance actually to be in that presidential debate. My numbers started going up in the polls after the Iowa caucus, and the TV cameras started coming around, and I found myself answering a lot of questions from the media. Late one night in the Wayfair hotel or motel in Manchester, in one of the rooms, an anchor woman from one of the networks said, "Governor Alexander, you talk a lot about families and communities. less of government, more of ourselves. Let me ask you, she said, what are you doing in your own community? I was tired and I said something like, I've been doing very much for the last year and a half. I've been busy. And she said, Governor Alexander, we're all busy. Well, about 3 weeks later, I got a vacation from the voters, and I went back to Tennessee. And I called up Major Worthy at the Salvation Army. He had called me about a year earlier, and he'd asked me to help. And I said, well, do you still need help? Yes, I do, he said. I'm in a target-rich environment. We're outnumbered and surrounded, and so I'm down there once a week, not doing nearly as much as I should or would like to, with a team of people who are trying to help some families that are in desperate need of help in the area around that Salvation Army headquarters. We already know that it takes longer than we thought, that there's more failures than successes, or more failures than we'd like. We already know it would be a lot more convenient for us if somebody else would do what we're doing, say the government. But we all agree, not in any political way, that we've gotten to the point in our country where there are some things, like the condition of those families, the abuse of drugs, creating the best schools in the world, making our own streets safe, that really can't be solved by a government at a distance, and maybe not by any government at all. So the message of the Republican Party is a message of hope for the future, but it's one with a dose of inconvenience as well. Less of government, more of ourselves. It's a message worth trying to persuade a majority of Americans that it is right. I was thinking that today when I visited the City on the Hill Charter School here in Boston. I happen to think that that way of giving teachers a chance to create a great school is the single best first step toward a goal of giving every child a chance to go to one of the best schools in America. And I would like to see a president and a governing party standing out there saying, let's increase the number of these schools. Let's limit the court orders and the union rules and the government regulations that get in the way of this. Let's insist on high academic standards. And let's give especially middle and low-income families many options of the best of these schools until every school is a charter school. A Republican Party that is a governing party will be on the side of Sarah Cass, who is the leader of that school. Will be on the side of the team of people in Nashville at the Salvation Army trying to find a better way than our tragic welfare system in helping those families get back on their feet. We'll be creating a picture of the great American outdoors as seen by Republicans, and maybe then as seen by the whole country. And we'll be helping to create a Congress that has more respect than it has today because it spends less time in Washington and more time with us. So that is why I'm energized by the election. I can see a tremendous opportunity for the Republican Party if we can learn to say what we're for. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, the governor will now receive questions, and we have a microphone here and a microphone here, and if you'll please come forward and very briefly identify yourself and your connection with the university, and also state your question, and if you'll try to keep those short so we can get in as many questioners as possible. John?
Thank you, Governor Alexander. It's good to have you here. Thank you for coming. I'm John Turner, a senior at the college. And my question is, the sort of Republican vision you've been describing seems to me really a lot closer to what we've been hearing lately of Bill Clinton and Al Gore than it does to some elements of the Republican Party. For example, I'm from Texas, and in Texas, the Republican Party convention endorsed the abolition of the minimum wage and mandating teaching of creation science in the public schools, a unilateral withdrawal from the UN, and a return to the gold standard. Now, none of those quite seemed, the sort of Republican vision you were describing just now. Obviously, the Democrats have to try to move their national party closer to the center. And Clinton and Gore have been talking about opportunity, responsibility, community, government that helps people solve their own problems. Which party do you think is best poised to maintain that ground? Which party do you think can best deal with the elements that would throw it off track for the year 2000?
Thank you, John, for your question. In my purely objective sense, of course, I think the Republican Party is in the best position to do that, but I think you've hit a very good point. Give President Clinton credit. He did a good job of framing the issues for the Democratic Party. And I think as a Republican, I would argue that let's wait and see what he does. And coming back to the same example I used a minute ago, but let's take the charter school example. President Clinton, to his credit, has endorsed the idea of charter schools, and his administration has actually created some money for it. There's an issue in this state, which is, I think, the leader in charter schools in terms of the kind that they are, of whether we'll have 75 or 25. I think the president, if he really believes that what he said, should come here and endorse lifting the cap on charter schools. Or let's go to the question of welfare. Very troubling question. The president's worked on it for a long time. I know he did that as governor because I worked on it with him. But we're going to come to a crossroads in the spring when we might see children in a soup line for breakfast at the Salvation Army headquarters in any city. And one side will say, let's fix the welfare system and put back in more of the system we had. And the question will be, does the other side, does our side say, well, we've got a better idea? I think we're better poised to provide the real answer to the country that will work, but I think we've got a more difficult sell. I think our message is harder because it offers inconvenience with a hope. And I also think we've not done a very good job over the last several years of doing it. So the Democrats' advantage is they've got President Clinton and Al Gore, both of whom are very able. Our advantage is I think we've got the better position. Our disadvantage is we haven't been attending choir practice.
Thank you.
Thank you. Sir.
Hi, my name is Brent Dusing. I'm a freshman at the college. I agree with your assertion that Republicans, we need to get our message out and show people the positive aspects that we can bring to government. However, one of the strengths of the Democrats has been that their ability to find the outsider candidate, somebody that brings a fresh approach to the party and brings up a groundswell of support. How do we, as Republicans, stray away from, I think, maybe what has been our failing in the past 2 elections of taking the party stalwart and more find somebody that encompasses the positive vision that the Republican Party has to offer?
That's a very intelligent question, and I wish if I'd been able to make my argument last February as well as you asked the question, I might have been the nominee, because that was basically my position. It is true the Democrats have, the presidents they've elected have been governors, have been outsiders, and we Republicans have become more the party of Washington. I think that's a problem for us. Years ago, when Washington was dominated by a liberal Democratic establishment, a lot of people set out actually to take that establishment on and to create a number of organizations in Washington that were conservative establishments to provide a different ideology. They did a very good job. They did such a good job that almost all the action in the Republican Party has been in Washington. And one of the bad things about that has been that whenever you get a lot of people who get together and just talk to each other, pretty soon no one can understand what they're saying. So one of our problems is we sound like a bunch of Washington lawyers in the convention half the time, and we don't sound like we have a clue about what's going on in everyday life. So we need to change that.
How do we do that?
Well, one way to do that would be to change our primary system, to spread out the primaries a little more so lesser known candidates like the 32 governors that we have would have a chance to compete in more than the New Hampshire primary. A second way to do it is we've now passed the leadership of our party to a new generation, and we have a number of people, many of them governors, including your governor in Massachusetts, who are good, strong leaders and who are going to be heard and who, if they decide to, can be national leaders. So I think you'll see more of our leadership from outside Washington.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Rachel Dayette, and I am a first-year PhD student in the Political Economy and Government program here. I was very happy to hear you say that education is your passion, because education is also my passion. But I was a little troubled by a couple of things. One is that, if I heard you correctly, you said that you had been working to abolish the education department since 1980.
Yeah.
Yet you served as President Bush's education secretary later, or after that date. And also, the proposal to abolish the Department of Education, to me, sends a message that education is not valued enough by the federal government to warrant a cabinet position. And I think it's great, your emphasis on charter schools, but I think that there's a real role that the federal government could play in terms of leadership on education issues and being a voice for school quality. And how would you propose to fill that kind of leadership vacuum if we do abolish the Department of Education?
Thank you for the question. The Department of Education was created in '79. I was elected in '78. I was elected governor of the third poorest state, and I was trying to think of a way for us to raise family incomes, and that led me very quickly to education. And I went to see President Reagan and asked him to get the federal government out of education because it was contributing very little money, a lot of rules, and the worst thing it was doing was leading the people to think that by doing something in Washington, we could create a better school in Maryville, Tennessee. And you really can't. It's too far removed. At the charter school where I was this morning, the one complaint I heard was about the federal drug abuse money. Now, you can just see that happening. Somebody in Washington, drugs are bad, we need a little program, let's have a little money. But by the time it gets down to the ninth grade classroom, the principal or the teacher is saying, I can use the money, but you want me to do it this way and your way, and you add up all these rules and regulations and you hamstring the teachers who know what to do. So I wanted to put the spotlight on our need. I thought if we wanted to have good schools in Tennessee, we'd have to do it ourselves. I still believe that. But I don't wake up every morning wanting to abolish the U.S. Department of Education. I do wake up every morning wanting to create a lot more of the best schools in the world, and I think eventually we'll see that the best way to spend the federal money for elementary and secondary schools will be the way we spend our money for colleges. I'd take all the federal money we have and create a GI Bill for kids, which would be scholarships to middle and low-income families, which they could use at the school that they thought was best for them, just as many Harvard students or Boston College students or University of Tennessee students use a federal scholarship for that purpose. I think there could be eventually a lot of federal money for that. I think most of it would go to public schools, just as most of the federal Pell Grants go to public universities. So that's the problem. The main reason I wanted rid of it was because it was in the way, and it led people to think that you could actually make schools better from Washington. I don't believe you can.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes.
Hi, my name is Veit Dengler. I'm a doctoral student from Austria, and I have a question about foreign policy. The U.S. has had the tendency to, since the end of the Cold War, to throw its weight around a little bit, sometimes beneficially, as on Bosnia, sometimes in a way that costs you a lot of political capital, as on the United Nations or Cuba, Burton Helms. Could you give us a sense of what President Lamar, or since you haven't declared for 2000 yet,
No, I haven't.
what your vision for America in the concert of nations is, and working the alliance and the United Nations?
That's a very important question and would require a longer answer than I can give here. So I'll give a short answer and try to make it as responsive as I can. As a country, we've been thrashing around a little bit with what do we do in the post-Cold War era, just like I've suggested the Republican Party is thrashing a little bit about what we're for in the post-big government era. So we don't know that yet. But our challenge is this. We should first say we're the only comprehensive superpower, technologically, militarily, economically, in the world, but only for a little while. This won't last long. So what can we do to help make the world a safer place during that time? I think the principles that are important to us are maintain our strength in the world. Number two, I think we should move to remodel the institutions that we've now got. I think that's easier than creating new ones, and I think specifically of NATO and the UN, to make them relevant for the post-Cold War world. As an example, should NATO, as I mentioned earlier, be engaged in out-of-area activities, which now it officially doesn't, but which in the future it might. That might limit our need to be involved in so many hotspots around the world as we are today. Finally, another principle that I would use is I think we need to be proud, strong enough to trade in the whole world as a way of increasing our standard of living and maintaining our job growth. And having a Republican Party that asserts its role in the world and insists that we trade in the world will be a very contentious issue within our party and within the country over the next few years.
Good evening.
Good evening.
My name is Kishan. I'm studying public policy here at the Kennedy School, but I just graduated last year from Dartmouth College in Hanover, New Hampshire, where for my senior year I was able to observe up close the goings-on of the New Hampshire primary. In fact, I met you a couple times and have one of your great red plaid shirts in my closet.
Oh, you do?
I do. Should have worn it tonight.
Yeah, you should have.
I would, however, like to ask you a question about the primary, though. You've spoken about primary reform and in terms of spreading the primary dates out and giving more candidates a chance. I was wondering if you could speak to a primary effect that they teach us about here at the Kennedy School, that of forcing candidates towards the fringes of their parties, particularly for Republicans and particularly in New Hampshire, forcing candidates to become more conservative when they campaign there. Do you feel this is a big problem? Do you feel it's a problem that can be reformed? And do you think that a moderate conservative Republican such as yourself can win New Hampshire?
Well, I think the answer to that is yes to the last question. The parties do tend, the primaries, because fewer people participate, do tend to drive the debate to the right and to the left. The bad in that is that the party then emphasizes a part of its personality that's the least attractive during October when it wants to win a general election. The good in it is it refreshes the debate and the basic principles of the Democratic Party to the left, the Republican Party to the right, and nominates someone who has a core support for his party. It gave President Clinton an advantage and may give Al Gore an advantage later when they don't really have a primary and they just run straight for October and don't go through that period of refreshment or worse, whatever you call it. One way to deal with that is to have a primary system that doesn't end with the first primary. Because if the candidates had been, because of the nature of the competition, forced to continue for a couple of more months through more primaries, then you would have been dealing in states with many more people, and you would have had a number of primary voters who were more representative of the country at large. I didn't feel in the primary like I had to adjust any of my views to run. I didn't do it. Of course, I didn't win either. But I think if you do that, people see through that and they don't vote for you because they don't think you're sincere. But it is a problem. It's an honest problem, and it will be helped by a longer primaries. Not a longer primary system, but a primary contest that includes more states.
All right, thank you.
Hi, Governor. My name's Josh Gibson. I'm a first-year student at
Yes,
the
sir.
Kennedy School, and I'm just having difficulty reconciling a couple of your views.
Only two?
Yeah, just two, just two for now. You talk about the emphasis the Republican Party puts on returning responsibility to citizens on one hand, but then on the other hand, you favor term limits, where the government is telling individuals who they can and cannot re-elect to Congress. If you have a responsible citizen legislator and the constituents want to send that person back for a term beyond the term limit, the government's essentially telling them, you're out of luck. How do you reconcile those views?
Well, you're correct in saying that's simply a conflict of principles on my part, and that happens a lot within a political process. You've got two ideals that collide, and it does limit, in a Republican government, your right to elect anybody you want. It's limited in other ways, of course, by the number of people in your state, et cetera. But you're right about that. I think the overriding principle is that I think it's absolutely essential to restore the respect we have for Congress in a country that's supposed to depend on representative government rather than push a button and vote on whatever you want. And I think term limits and a citizen Congress would help break up the claque in Washington that operates in a language and with a set of views that is largely unrepresentative of the everyday conversation in the rest of the country. So your point is right, but that principle for me overrides the limit we place on your right to do it. Plus, I've had the privilege of being a governor, and I was governor for 2 terms. I thought I was a great governor, but after 8 years, I was getting tired, and I think the voters were getting tired of me, and we were a state of 5 million people, and there were plenty of other people who could be governor. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes.
Hi, Governor. My name is Wes Gilchrist. I'm a junior at the college. I'm a fellow Republican, a fellow Southerner from Alabama, and so one of the things I'm most interested in politically is education. Being as I'm from the state, I think that's now 48th in just about everything. I think we're beating out Mississippi and Arkansas right now, but I'll have to check. I'm not really sure. So I'm really interested in some of the things you did during the 80s as far as education is concerned. But another thing that I'm worried about, Republicans in general, especially my governor now, Fob James, I don't know if you've had a chance to meet him. It seems that there's a strong, slant in the conservative, in the Republican Party, which I agree with, that wants to send power back to the states, especially on education, and which I fully agree with. But in turn, I then think that the states have to do their share. And I'm worried about the Republican Party in states such as Alabama, where they don't want the state government to do anything either. They don't want the national government to do anything. They don't want the state government to do anything. I mean, I understand, the logic behind that, but I think it's sort of self-defeating, and especially on issues that are so important, especially the issue of education. Like, how do we as Republicans reconcile that? And why are there so many Republicans who refuse to acknowledge that if, on the issue of education, if the national government doesn't do it, which I don't think they should, that the states are going to have to step up and start doing more?
Well, my short answer would be most of the governors I know, and especially most of the Republican governors, are in the lead on trying to improve the schools. I mean, they're in the lead on charter schools to try to include, to try to create better schools. They're in the lead on higher academic standards. They're in the lead on giving middle and low income people more choices, and most are spending more money. I know that when I was the governor of Tennessee, that even though we were a poor state, we increased the percent of our budget that we spent on education so we could have centers of excellence at the universities and pay teachers more for teaching well and put computers in the classroom. So I hope that Republican governors and any Republican president we have puts education at the top of the list. It doesn't bother me to spend money, including federal money, on education. I just don't want the management of education to be at a distance from the classroom, and I especially don't want it to be in Washington.
Governor Alexander, my name is Trent Taylor. I'm at the law school. I'm from Dyersburg, Tennessee.
You are.
I've followed your political career for a long time, and I just wanted to go back to the primary and ask you, it seems you came so close, and of course I was rooting hard for you, but I was wondering if you had to do it all over again, whether you'd do anything differently.
Yeah. I would try to find a way to win would be I can figure out how the University of Tennessee can beat the University of Florida in football after the game's over. So hindsight's always very illuminating. I think from my point of view, if I were trying to perform better as a candidate, I would have learned to headline my message, shorten it, say it more crisply. I would have talked more about education, which I care about and which I think is important to people, which I didn't talk about enough. Those are some things I would have done as a candidate. As a campaign technique, we were tied on the Thursday before the New Hampshire primary, apparently, and there were a number of negative ads that started running on Friday, and they ran till Tuesday, and it slowed me down. And a lot of people say, well, if that hadn't happened, I might have at least beat Senator Dole. So looking back on it, I think I would like to be smart enough to find a way to find an antidote to negative ads and phone calls that are sprung on you in the last 4 days of a primary. campaign. I'm not sure I know what I could have done, because when you're a new candidate and people don't know you very well, if someone comes on, and you have limited funds because you're limited in what you can raise, if people then come on with unlimited funds and say a lot of things about you, you really don't have time to get those ideas out of the voters' mind. So I haven't figured out in retrospect what I would have done, but if I were to ever run again, I will have clearly in mind what I will do during the last 4 days of any New Hampshire primary.
Thanks.
Sir.
Hi,
No, ma'am.
my name is Anne Marie Randazzo, and I'm a first-year student at the Kennedy School. I've listened to you and others talk quite a bit about how we should fix education at the lower levels for the next generation to come up. I was wondering if you think it's possible, and how you think it's possible, if you do think it is, that we would address the problems of people who are in college now or young professionals that have suffered from maybe inadequate education but are supposed to be leading the first part of the 21st century.
It's a great question, and it's a real problem, because the standards are higher. I mean, if you go to work today, you're expected to know a lot more, a lot of different skills. If you even change jobs, you might have to know new skills. And there are a lot of people who graduated from high school, even college, who don't know and aren't able to do enough to hold the jobs they need to have. The secret weapon we've gotten in this country are community colleges. Community colleges. Virtually every state has them. The tuition at the community colleges in Tennessee is $1,000 a year. You can get a federal grant loan to help pay for that. The teaching is excellent. When I was president of the University of Tennessee, we would actually encourage students to go there in their freshman and sophomore year and then say, we'll save a place for you at the university if you want to continue your education. When I go to the community colleges, from the audience, the cry most often at commencement is, way to go, Mom. It's the mom going back to school to get a degree as she goes from this job to the next job. So the short answer would be community colleges.
Hi, my name is Jennifer Lee, and I'm a student here at the Graduate School of Education. I'm a Republican at heart, I think, but as a Wellesley/Hillary Clinton College graduate, I came to embrace the Democratic platform more and more. Governor Alexander, can you try to convince me, a woman and a person of color, why I should vote for a Republican?
Yes, I'd like to have the opportunity to do that. What I'd like to say to you first is that in the new century, that we're going to have to do things differently to solve the problems, the everyday problems that all of us, maybe especially women, care the most about. I think men and women care about the same problems, but the problems I'm talking about are who will help the children who are a part of families that are broken, who will provide the best schools for your children, who will be honest with you about how we will end drug use. And I believe the honest answer to dealing with those problems is not to continue to say that we can increase a department in Washington and spend a little bit more money on a federal program and everything will be all right. I don't believe it will be. So I think we have to say we need to have less reliance on Washington, a different kind of government, and we really have to mobilize ourselves to create the charter schools for children, to devise neighborhood, fully funded neighborhood programs to replace the Washington welfare programs, and that future is more likely to extend the promise of American life to the largest number of Americans.
Thank you.
Thank you for your question.
Governor Alexander, my name is Ken Miller. I'm a former Republican candidate for state representative. I'm an unemployed engineer, and I'm an applicant to a Doctor of Science program in health policy and management here. About three or 4 weeks ago, we had Boutros Boutros-Ghali from the UN addressing us. One of the issues he discussed was the trade-off of human rights versus terrorism. And I'd like to get your opinion on the role of specialized UN agencies such as the International Civil Aviation, International Telecommunications, or International Atomic Energy Agency in improving human rights in the world and continuing in a peaceful, nonviolent world. I would like to know if you would support those objectives of the UN in the future?
You know, I don't know enough about those 3 specialized agencies of the UN to give you a good answer. So what I'd have to do is to sit down with you and find out more about them, and then probably ask 1 or 2 other people and give you an answer after that. I respect your question, but I don't want to just try to wing an answer of that importance.
Thank you.
I'm Oderisio Piscichelli. I'm a master's student at the law school from Italy. You depicted an interesting picture of what you think the Republican Party should be in the future, but what the Republican Party will be in the future is not entirely depending on your views.
I've discovered that.
So you didn't talk about what you think the role of the angry man in the Republican Party will be, the people that were speaking very loud until some months ago and will probably speak loud in another while. And probably people like Pat Buchanan is very good at doing what you said should be done, like framing issues or giving vivid representations, or he probably has a vision, but it's probably not yours. And what do you think the role of these people will be in the Republican Party?
Well, it's a big, rowdy, complicated party, and Pat's got a place in it as long as he wants to be in it to contest for his views. But the angry man, as you say, can either be a loud part of a minority party or an influential part of a governing party. And until we can say what our schools will look like, what our program to help people is, what we would do if we balanced the budget, what would actually happen after we moved responsibilities back to the states, I don't think we'll be allowed to be a governing party. So I think our party needs to look for people who have a capacity to paint a picture of the future instead of just say what we're against. And maybe people who have that capacity will have to say it a little more loudly and a little more forcefully and a little more often in the next 2 or 3 years.
My name's Fred Kacher. I'm at the Kennedy School of Government. I'm also a Republican, and I'm interested in your view on how the Republican Party can best handle the abortion issue, something that's continued to plague the party, and I'd like to hear your views on it.
Well, the first thing to do is to be honest about it. We're split. We disagree on an issue that's very important and that is morally based and that is a matter of personal decision. And we're always going to be split on it. That's number one. And I think being honest about that is a good step in respecting each other's views about it. Second, my view, I'm pro-life. I'm also a Federalist. You'll hear me running through all this that I don't like decisions made in Washington on a large number of issues, and that's one of them. It's a rare case. The partial birth abortion case is one, when I think there ought to be a federal involvement in the abortion area. Otherwise, keep it out of there and let the states and the communities and individuals make that decision. I don't know whether the Republican Party could move to that point of view, which would be a different view than the party platform has today. The third approach we should take, I think, is to focus on the issues that unite us. I don't think the presidential election ought to be primarily about pro-choice versus pro-life. The Democrat Party doesn't frame it that way, neither should we. I think we should focus on jobs, families, and schools, and leading the country to expect less of government and more of ourselves. That would be the best way to unite our party and to present our major issues.
Good evening, Governor. My name is Stephen Mitby. I'm a second-year student at the college, and on behalf of the Harvard Republican Club, I'd like to thank you for coming here.
Thank you.
We're delighted that you had the courage to come. Not too long ago at Harvard, Ralph Reed spoke and was given a rather shabby reception by a small but vocal minority of people who stood up during the middle of his speech and held up insulting signs. They were dressed in costumes, and when Dr. Sharp asked them to leave, they refused. They eventually had to be carried out by the police. Now, as the president of the University of Tennessee, how do you think that universities should handle situations like that and make sure that all views, regardless of how popular they are in the academy today and whether they're politically correct or not, are heard on campus so that reasoned debate can take place?
Well, I'm not president of the University of Tennessee anymore, but it's still a good question. I think it is very important for universities especially to practice what we preach. I mean, one reason we exist, universities, is to give people a chance to say what they believe. And we even celebrate the idea of giving people to say silly things at universities. And we listen to that, and we respect that, and we honor their right to do it. Now, if you honor someone's right, a matter of common courtesy and civility, I think, is to listen. And I think that it would be my role as president of the University of Tennessee that if any member of the university community constantly interfered with
I'm a second-year student at the college, and on behalf of the Harvard Republican Club, I'd like to thank you for coming here.
Thank you.
We're delighted that you had the courage to come. Not too Not too long ago at Harvard, Ralph Reed spoke and was given a rather shabby reception by a small but vocal minority of people who stood up during the middle of his speech and held up insulting signs. They were dressed in costumes, and when Dr. Sharp asked them to leave, they refused. They eventually had to be carried out by the police. Now, as the president of the University of Tennessee, how do you think that universities should handle situations like that and make sure that all views, regardless of how popular they are in the academy today and whether they're politically correct or not, are heard on campus so that reasoned debate can take place?
Well, I'm not president of the University of Tennessee anymore, but it's still a good question. I think it is very important for universities especially to practice what we preach. I mean, one reason we exist, universities, is to give people a chance to say what they believe. And we even celebrate the idea of giving people to say silly things at universities. And we listen to that, and we respect that, and we honor their right to do it. Now, if you honor someone's right, a matter of common courtesy and civility, I think, is to listen. And I think that it would be my role as president of the University of Tennessee that if any member of the university community constantly interfered with the right of someone to say what they wanted to say at the university, I might ask them to spend a day with me, or maybe 2, or maybe 3. And I would try during my conversations every day to hear what they had to say and to tell them what I think about life and to try to suggest to them as best I could the importance of listening and common courtesy to other people's points of view. I wouldn't, the first time they did it, kick them out of the university. I would assume that when you're at college, you're expected to do some dumb things, and that would be one of them. Thank you. Yeah.
Good evening, Mr. Alexander. My name is Barbara Martinez. I'm a freshman here at the college. I, like you, am a supporter of charter schools. I think they're one of the best ways we have to solve problems in public education. However, there's an issue with them in terms of funding. What is your position on funding of public education? In terms of charter schools, should that funding come from the state, federal government, or from towns that send children to public schools? And also, what is your position on income versus property taxes for public education?
Well, the question of which tax would be a state and local decision, income versus property. In our state, we don't have an income tax. We have a sales tax and a property tax. And the state pays 47 or 8% of the cost of local schools, and the local governments pay about the same, and the federal government pays about 6%. In terms of the funding of charter schools are just another public school. So they should be funded just like every other public school. In the end, I think every school ought to be a charter school. It ought to be free of all these regulations and impediments. It ought to have great leaders and great teachers. It ought to have high academic standards and be safe and discipline-free, and parents ought to have a lot of options of them. So if you open a new public school, the way you pay for it is the money just follows the kid to the school. And I think that's what you do with a charter school in Massachusetts or any other place. There are only a certain number of students, and you take the available amount of money and you divide it up among the students, and where they go to school is, I think, should be their business, although the local school district makes some of those decisions.
Would you support a state aid to schools where a lot of children do go to charter schools and therefore they're losing money for the maintenance of their buildings and spaces in classrooms?
No, I would just treat them all as public schools, all deserving of the same support. And if you find students moving out of one school because they prefer to go to another school, I think the question you ask is, how do we give more money to the school people are leaving? I mean, why would you do that? I mean, if everybody was buying a Ford instead of a Chevrolet, would you give a subsidy to Chevrolet, or would you ask them to make a better car? I mean, they might be leaving because the school closes at 3 and the mom works till 6. They might prefer the charter school, which is open to 6. Well, open the other public school to 6. Then they might stay there. That would be my reaction. Yes, sir.
Hello, Governor. My name is Daniel Lyons. I'm also a freshman here at the college. I'd like to say that the ABC Alexander beats Quentin message made it loud and clear in Southern California, where I'm from.
Well, good for you.
But
maybe I should have spent more time there.
But I'd like to ask you two questions, actually. One relating to domestic policy and how Congress could beat the problem of demosclerosis, the fact that we seem to be able to introduce all these great new ideas, but we can't seem to end them once we find out that they don't do any good. And the second would be in international relations, how the Clinton administration should deal with China and the fact that they keep thumbing their nose at a lot of different nuclear non-proliferation treaties and bullying Taiwan and things like that.
Well, the short answer to the two questions is on number 2, we should engage China. Stop dealing with them on an episodic press relations type of activity. The president should send the 2 wisest friends he has, who are best respected by the Chinese leaders, privately to China, to find out what is important to them and let them know what is important to us. And one of those ought to be the nuclear nonproliferation. And over time, behind the scenes, we should engage them and deal with them. The first question is oversight. You know, in the movie about Mrs. Robinson, they whispered in plastics back in the 60s was the word would be oversight. We have a Republican Congress. It can't set the national agenda because it's not the president. But one power it does have, which is underused, is the legislative power of oversight. And instead of wrangling with regulations, I would suggest Congress take whole chunks of the law and sunset it over a period of time, eliminate it, along with the regulations, and use its oversight, hearing, and authority to replace that law with a new, simpler law and fewer organizations. And I think if a Republican Congress went through the entire federal government on a priority basis like that over 5 or 10 years, it could make an enormous contribution. The oversight function of Congress has been generally ignored over the last decade.
Thank you.
Sir.
Good evening, Governor. It was a pleasure to vote for you in the Maine primary. I'm Rob Smith. I'm from Maine. I'm attending a conference on juvenile justice. And
good. Well,
hope to
thanks for
see
being here.
your name on the ballot in the year 2000. My question is twofold. I recently had dinner with Bill Cohen, who was retiring as our senior senator from Maine, and I said, you know, Bill, why are you leaving? And he said, Rob, I can't take it anymore. I feel that I'm irrelevant. The Senate has been pushed to the extremes where, you know, the extreme left and the extreme right seem to rule everything, and I no longer really feel I can make that much of a difference, so it's time to move on. And I guess I'm concerned, Governor, that our party, our Republican Party, what are we going to do to reach out to people like the Bill Cohens and the Nancy Castlebaums and some of the other people who are quitting, who seem to find that they don't have much of a place anymore. And when I was trying to explain to people why to vote for Bob Dole, I had quite a hard time in that they seem to, moderate independent people seem to think that, well, the Republican Party is too extreme, and why would I want to, even though Clinton has got all these problems, why would I want to be voting for Dole? So I guess I'm just concerned that when someone like Al Inspector runs for president and he's immediately written off as, well, he's pro-choice, he can't win, why waste your time even talking to him? I think that's a dangerous problem that our party is having. And it's sort of the second part of the question is that I work with young people, troubled kids, and to a whole, in fact, right down to the last one, they have no respect for politicians. They have no respect for the President of the United States or for people who are running for city council. They see the whole political process as just a dirty, ugly, slimy, mud wrestling affair. And, you know, you spoke a little bit about the negative commercials. I think if we're ever going to get back to, you know, reach out to those common people, we've got to have some real serious reform of our political system. So I'd like to hear your comments on that.
Two good points. The first question, of course, Bill Cohen, who's been a terrific senator, and Nancy Kassebaum, the same, have both been there for 3 terms. They've been there a long time. And I know our Senator, Howard Baker, after he'd been there 3 terms, said it was time to go. And I think 2 or 3 terms is long enough. And I'm thinking that maybe the answer to that part of the question is, I think our party is going to be forced to be more constructive. You've probably by now tired of hearing me say that we need to spend more time saying what we're for, painting our picture of the future. But if we're forced to do that in order to be a governing party, the tone of what we have to say will be different. I mean, if we're talking about how we're going to create the best school in the world instead of in the Department of Education, if our focus is on the first instead of the second, that's a more constructive approach, and that may be more appealing to people who are turned off. It may not be a matter of philosophy so much as whether we've been really trying to be a governing party or an opposition party. On the negative attitude toward people in politics, I'm sorry to see that too, and I'm sure a part of that is brought on by those of us in public life. But I've been in and out of public life now for about 30 years. Most of my time I've been in private business. I live in Nashville. I'm vice chairman of a company. I've worked in Washington for a few years. Most of the people I've known have been first-class people. They've tried to do the right thing. But that image doesn't come across so much. And part of the reason is the kind of media coverage. 86% of the network comment about the presidential race was negative about the candidates and the campaigns. Well, it may have been bad, but it's not that bad. I mean, if you really had to pick a committee of distinguished Harvard officials to select a Republican and a Democrat to run for president rather than a primary process, they might have very well picked a distinguished war hero who had served in Congress well and had a reputation for honesty and for skillful legislation on the Republican side, and a progressive middle state governor who'd been a Rhodes Scholar on the other side. There are a lot of good in both Bob Dole and Bill Clinton. And about the only time we got to see that was when they had a chance to speak for themselves. So if I had a one-sentence suggestion about how to improve the opinion most people have of people in politics, it would be give them more opportunities to speak for themselves. Show them for 3 minutes saying what they want to do about welfare, rather than say what you think about them and let the voters themselves make up their mind about whether they're good people or bad people. I think that would immediately improve the reputation of most people in politics. This will be the last question.
Okay. Good evening, Mr. Alexander. My name is Jeremy Dolbeck. I'm a first-year MPP here. I actually grew up near Copper Hill, Tennessee. I don't know if you know where that's
I know
at.
exactly where it is. Looks like the moon.
Yeah, it does. You can actually see it from space. But I wanted to ask you, most of the solutions you've talked about seem to be addressed towards suburban schools, and with rural schools, issues of having a voucher or something that might be nice if you're in a suburban school where the next school is 5 miles away, but in a rural school where I grew up, you know, the next school is 35 miles away, and it's really, you don't have those sort of choices. Some of the solutions they came up with were satellite TV. I also have sort of issues with a voucher system in general, worries about separation of church and state, and because I think a lot of people feel that many people would use the vouchers to support sending their children to religious schools.
They might. Those are two. Your point is correct. In rural areas where there are fewer schools, fewer choices, having the chance to choose doesn't mean as much as it might somewhere else. But if you were in Polk County or Tennessee and your high school didn't offer an advanced physics course, you might want to be able to take your voucher or scholarship and drive into Hamilton County to the nearest high school that did, or even to the community college that offered that course. In Minnesota, when 10 years ago they pioneered by giving all students a choice of all public schools, they found a lot of the rural schools got busy offering additional courses to make sure that somebody didn't drive from their town to another town just because a course wasn't offered. So it had a pretty good effect. And what was the other question?
Well, it was about the concerns with separation of church and state with the voucher system.
The separation of church and state with the question of scholarships. You know, it's interesting that we've had that in the United States now for about 60 years, and it hasn't created much of a problem. The GI Bill that Bob Dole used to go to the University of Kansas. He could have used to go to Boston College or Yeshiva or Fisk or Brigham Young. In fact, hundreds of thousands of veterans of World War II used their GI Bill for veterans to go to Catholic high schools to finish their education. And about half the students at all the colleges in America have federal grants or loans, and the Supreme Court has ruled as long as the money goes to the student, who then chooses the school, that it's not a church and state issue. So as long as there were federal or state scholarships that simply followed money to schools that students chose, I don't think there's a federal scholarship. I mean, there's a church-state problem. I believe we'll be redefining what we mean by public education. See, I think a public school in the new century will be any school. It might be operated by a private management company. It might be operated by a church. It might be a school in a corporation, so a mother can bring the child to work and put the child in school when she goes to work and take the child home when she goes home. Might be any of those. But as long as all students are welcome, as long as government money follows the child to the school, and as long as the school is accountable to public authorities, then in my view, it's a public school. Any school that stays outside that, like the Quaker schools probably would, and would not want any government money touching the school, would be a private school.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Governor. We're delighted to have you here. Thank you.